Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, April 11th, 1861, 3:30 a.m. The only sounds were the gentle lap of water against fortress walls and the nervous breathing of men standing guard. Inside Fort Sumter, Major Robert Anderson peered into oppressive darkness, knowing the Confederate courier had delivered an ultimatum: evacuate or face bombardment. The nation's peace hung on a single thread, stretched to breaking over one irreducible question: a man's right to own another. The thread snapped at 4:30 a.m. on April 12th. A single mortar shell, arcing like a falling star, signalled the barrage. To Charleston's elegant society, watching from rooftops with picnic baskets as if at a theatre, it was a glorious spectacle of sovereignty. What they couldn't see was the abyss, a chasm of fire and blood that would consume over 700,000 lives and redefine America's soul. In the war's first spring, young men in blue and grey rushed to enlist, fueled by intoxicating belief that the conflict would be brief and heroic. They paraded through town squares to community cheers in bright, unstained uniforms. A Union soldier from Ohio wrote home, "We will be in Richmond in 90 days." A Virginia recruit boasted, "One Southerner can whip 10 Yankees." Both were tragically wrong. The illusion shattered on the rolling fields of Manassas that July. The first Bull Run began with the pageantry of flags and marching bands. It ended in a chaotic Union retreat, tangled with civilian carriages on the Warrenton Turnpike. The South celebrated victory that solidified their resolve, but mangled bodies on Henry House Hill were a grim omen. This would be no simple quarrel. It would be total war. Into this maelstrom stepped Abraham Lincoln. Gaunt, homely, perpetually burdened, he had insisted his sole purpose was preserving the Union, not ending slavery. Yet he understood the war's deeper moral current. The Confederacy's greatest strength, the institution of slavery, was also its fatal moral vulnerability. To save the Union, he would have to destroy what defined the South. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued in September 1862 after the Pyrrhic Union victory at Antietam, was a masterstroke of military and political logic. Taking effect January 1st, 1863, it transformed the war. It freed only those enslaved in rebel territories, but it recast the Union Army as an army of liberation. It invited black men to enlist, and nearly 200,000 would, fundamentally altering the war's character and ensuring Union victory would mean national rebirth. Antietam, September 17, 1862, was the single bloodiest day in American history. In the cornfield, the West Woods, and at Bloody Lane, men were shredded by concentrated volleys and artillery. There were no tactics, only slaughter. By nightfall, over 23,000 lay dead or wounded. Matthew Brady's photographs, displayed in a New York gallery, brought horrifying reality home to a public accustomed to heroic illustrations. While the Union struggled to find competent commanders, the Confederacy had Robert E. Lee and Thomas Stonewall Jackson. Lee was the aristocratic Virginian, master of audacious, complex tactics. Jackson was the stern Presbyterian, a relentless hammer who believed in always pressing the attack. Together they humiliated a succession of Union generals in Virginia, making the Army of Northern Virginia seem invincible. But the Union possessed its own hidden strengths. While the South had brilliant commanders, the North wielded the relentless, crushing power of industry and population. Northern factories poured out rifles, cannons, boots, and railroads. Foundries like Tredegar in Richmond struggled to keep pace. The Union could replace its losses. The Confederacy could only mourn its diminishing ranks. Summer 1863 marked the war's great pivot. In the east, Lee's second invasion of the North culminated at Gettysburg. For 3 days, armies clashed in a battle of epic scale. Pickett's charge on the third day was a magnificent doomed walk into the heart of the Union line. As broken remnants streamed back, Lee told his men, "It is all my fault." The Confederacy's high tide had crested and begun to recede. Simultaneously, in the west, Ulysses S. Grant secured a victory of equal importance. After a protracted siege, Vicksburg, Mississippi surrendered on July 4th. The Union now controlled the entire Mississippi River, splitting the Confederacy in two. Grant, a rumpled, unheroic figure who chewed cigars and spoke little, had achieved what dashing predecessors could not. He understood that enemy armies, not territory, were the true objective. Beyond great battlefields, the war was brutal and intimate. It was fought in the bitter guerrilla warfare of Missouri and Kansas, where neighbor murdered neighbor. It was fought in naval blockades that slowly strangled the Southern economy, creating desperate shortages of salt, coffee, and cloth. It was fought by women who managed farms and plantations and who worked in burgeoning government offices, forever changing their place in society. Lincoln finally found his general in Grant. Unlike predecessors, Grant possessed a terrifying modern understanding. War was not a chivalric contest but mathematical equation of force. His strategy was simple, brutal, and revolutionary. He would use the North's overwhelming advantages to press the Confederacy on all fronts simultaneously, accepting casualties they couldn't match. The war would be won by attrition. Spring 1864, Grant launched his overland campaign. Battles in the wilderness, at Spotsylvania and Cold Harbor, were exercises in horror. The Union suffered staggering losses, over 50,000 casualties in 1 month. But after each bloody repulse, Grant didn't retreat to refit. He moved south, always sliding left, forcing Lee to stretch his thinning army to protect Richmond. The war had become siege. While Grant pinned Lee in Virginia, William Tecumseh Sherman marched from Chattanooga to Atlanta. Capturing the industrial hub, he launched his march to the sea with orders to make Georgia howl. His army cut a 60-mile-wide swath of destruction, burning plantations, seizing livestock, destroying railroads. This was psychological warfare, designed to break Southern will by proving the Confederacy couldn't protect its own heartland. For the common soldier, Billy Yank and Johnny Reb, war was monotonous hell of mud, disease and drill, punctuated by moments of sheer terror. They suffered dysentery and typhoid. They huddled in trenches that foreshadowed World War I. They fought not for abstract political ideals, but for the man beside them. Their letters home speak of deep, weary longing and a resilience that defies comprehension. Lincoln's war wasn't just against the South. He faced relentless opposition from Northern Democrats, the Copperheads, who demanded negotiated peace. In the 1864 election, with war stalemated and casualties mounting, Lincoln feared defeat. The Democratic platform called for armistice, which would have meant Confederate independence. Atlanta's fall in September saved his presidency and the Union cause. By 1865, the Confederacy was a ghost. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, once 90,000 strong, was reduced to fewer than 35,000 ragged, starving men. They held Petersburg trenches for 9 months, suffering starvation and exposure. The South had thrown its entire white male population into the fight and was running out of men, hope, and time. Charleston's aristocratic laughter had long since faded into grim silence of deprivation. April 2, 1865, Lee was forced to abandon Petersburg and Richmond. The Union Army entered the Confederate capital the next day. For the enslaved population, it was Jubilee. For white Southerners, apocalypse. The government fled, and the city set ablaze by retreating Confederates fell into chaos. The dream of a Southern nation was consumed by the very fires of war it had ignited. Lee's dwindling army was trapped at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th. Dressed in his finest uniform, he met Grant in Wilmer McLean's parlour. Grant, spattered with mud, offered generous terms. Confederate soldiers could return home with their horses and mules for spring planting and wouldn't be prosecuted for treason. It was an act of conciliation designed to begin healing a shattered nation. The arithmetic of destruction was final. An estimated 620,000 to 750,000 soldiers lay dead, more American deaths than all other wars from the Revolution through Vietnam combined. Hundreds of thousands more were maimed in body and spirit. The South was physical and economic ruin, its land scarred, its cities burned, its wealth, 4 million enslaved people, vanished. The Union was preserved, but at a price that would echo for generations. April 14, 1865, just 5 days after Appomattox, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. His death was catastrophic for reconciliation. The man who preached malice toward none, with charity for all, was gone, replaced by Andrew Johnson, whose weak leadership enabled the very forces Lincoln had fought to contain. The war had ended, but the battle for the peace, and for the meaning of freedom, had just begun. The war gave birth to a second American Republic, enshrined in the Reconstruction Amendments. The 13th abolished slavery. The 14th established birthright citizenship and equal protection. The 15th aimed to secure black male suffrage. These were monumental transformations of the Federal Compact, attempting to write the war's hard-won lesson of equality into the nation's fundamental law. This revolution met violent and determined counter-revolution. White Southern resistance, embodied by the Ku Klux Klan and paramilitary groups, used terror to re-establish racial control. Northern will to enforce Reconstruction waned, exhausted by years of conflict and swayed by propaganda about Negro rule. The Compromise of 1877 pulled the last federal troops from the South, and Jim Crow, a legalized system of segregation and disenfranchisement, began. To justify defeat and reassert moral standing, Southern intellectuals constructed a powerful myth: the lost cause. This narrative painted the Confederacy as noble struggle for states' rights, downplaying or erasing slavery as the cause. It romanticized Lee and Jackson, and portrayed Reconstruction as tragic period of corrupt carpetbagger rule. This myth would poison historical understanding for a century. The war became a crucible for modern medicine. Before 1861, most American doctors had never performed surgery. By 1865, they had conducted over 60,000 amputations and pioneered anesthesia, ambulance corps, and triage systems. Jonathan Letterman revolutionized battlefield medicine, creating the template for modern emergency care. Nurse Clara Barton's work would lead to the founding of the American Red Cross. The war's brutal harvest forced medical innovation that saved countless lives in conflicts to come. The war irrevocably shifted the nation's economic center. Northern industry, supercharged by wartime demand, exploded. The need for efficient transportation, supply, and communication led to innovations in manufacturing, finance, and railroad management. The Homestead Act, the Morrill Land Grant Act, and the Transcontinental Railroad Authorization all passed during the war, fueled westward expansion, and bound the continent with steel rails. The United States emerged not as a loose confederation of agricultural states, but as a centralized modern industrial power poised to dominate the 20th century. For decades after, the war was remembered through sectional reconciliation that came at the expense of black experience. Blue and grey veterans met at reunions, shaking hands across Gettysburg's stone walls. This reconciliation was built on shared memory of soldiers' valor, while slavery's central role and emancipation's promise were pushed to the margins of national consciousness. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s forced the nation to confront the unfulfilled promises of the Civil War. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. explicitly invoked the Emancipation Proclamation and Reconstruction Amendments. The movement was, in essence, the second act of the Civil War, a final non-violent battle to secure rights won on the battlefield but betrayed in peace. Today, the war's physical legacy is etched into the American landscape, from well-preserved battlefields, now hallowed ground, to countless monuments in town squares, monuments that themselves have become battlegrounds in a new cultural war over the nation's memory. Each cannon and stone soldier is testament to the conflict that nearly destroyed the United States. Perhaps no aspect reveals the war's tragedy more than the literal divisions within families. Confederate General James Longstreet's best man at his wedding was Union General Ulysses S. Grant. Mary Todd Lincoln lost 3 brothers fighting for the Confederacy. At the Battle of Antietam, Union Colonel Robert Gould Shaw fought against his own cousins. Kentucky Senator John Crittenden had one son become a Union general, another a Confederate general. They faced each other at Mill Springs. Thanksgiving dinners after 1865 were filled with empty chairs and unspoken grief, families forever fractured by allegiances that chose nation over blood. The Civil War continues to ask profound questions about the American experiment. What is the balance between federal authority and states' rights? Who is included in "we the people"? How does a nation founded on liberty reconcile itself with a history of oppression? These aren't settled historical debates. They are live wires in the nation's political soul. Abraham Lincoln's words, forged in war's furnace, remain the nation's moral compass. The Gettysburg Address, with its rededication to the proposition that all men are created equal, and his second inaugural's call to bind the nation's wounds with malice toward none, define the best aspirations of American character. He articulated the purpose of suffering and gave meaning to sacrifice. The Civil War was the defining test of whether a nation conceived in liberty could long endure. It was a harvest of steel, fire, and blood that yielded a new birth of freedom, however imperfect. It demonstrated that the Union was not a voluntary compact but perpetual entity, and established the federal government as ultimate guarantor of American citizens' rights. The final report on the Civil War cannot be written, for its last chapter is still being composed by every generation. The battlefield work is done, but the work of the nation that emerged, creating a more perfect union, ensuring justice, and securing liberty's blessings for all, remains, as Lincoln said, the great task before us. The guns' echoes gone, but the imperative of their lesson endures.